Nobody told you that raising your frequency would feel like losing everything. That's the part they leave out. The spiritual internet sells you this image of higher vibration as lightness, bliss, magnetic attraction, manifesting your dream life. But Carl Jung studied people who had genuinely undergone profound psychological transformation. And what he documented looked nothing like that glossy picture. The people operating at what we'd call a higher frequency weren't floating through life radiating peace. They were isolated. They were grieving relationships they had outgrown. They were sitting in rooms full of people, feeling more alone than they had ever felt, not because something was wrong with them, but because something had shifted in them so fundamentally that the world they used to fit into no longer had a place for them. Jung didn't use the language of vibration or frequency. He talked about individuation, about levels of consciousness, about the degree to which a person had integrated their shadow and moved towards psychological wholeness. But what he described maps perfectly onto what people mean when they talk about vibrating higher. It's not about being better than anyone else. It's about operating from a deeper layer of awareness that most people never access, and the specific, measurable ways that awareness changes how you move through reality. Today I'm going to walk you through 7 signs that you've shifted into this higher frequency of consciousness according to Jung's observations, why each sign feels more like a burden than a blessing, and what it actually means about who you're becoming if you recognize these patterns in yourself right now. The first sign is that conflict no longer energizes you. It exhausts you on a level you can't fully explain. There was a time when you could engage in arguments, debates, drama, and walk away feeling something. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was the satisfaction of being right. Maybe it was the intensity of emotional collision. But that time is over. Now, when conflict erupts around you, your entire system wants to leave. Not because you're afraid of confrontation, because something in you recognizes the futility of it before it even begins. Jung observed that people moving toward higher consciousness developed what he called an instinct for psychic economy. They stopped investing energy in exchanges that produced no real transformation, arguments where no one was actually listening, conflicts driven by ego rather than genuine disagreement, drama cycles that repeated endlessly without resolution. People at lower levels of awareness could engage in these loops indefinitely because the friction itself felt productive. But people who had done deep inner work recognized the loop for what it was, and their system refused to participate. This isn't apathy. You still care. You might care more than you ever have, but you've lost the ability to pretend that most conflict is actually about what people claim it's about. You see the wound underneath the argument. You recognize the projection driving the accusation. You perceive the fear behind the aggression. And knowing all of that makes it nearly impossible to engage at the surface level where the conflict is being performed. You'd have to pretend you don't see what you see, and you can't do that anymore. Think about someone who used to argue with their partner for hours about dishes, schedules, small grievances, and now can see that none of those arguments were ever about the dishes. They were about feeling unseen, feeling controlled, feeling like the relationship had become a transaction. Once you perceive the actual issue underneath the surface complaint, you can't go back to fighting about dishes. But if the other person can only operate at the surface level, there's nowhere for the conversation to go. So you go quiet, and they interpret your silence as not caring, when really you care so much that the performance of conflict feels unbearable. The second sign is that you've become almost impossible to manipulate, and this has cost you relationships. Jung found that people who had integrated significant portions of their shadow became extraordinarily difficult to control through guilt, shame, fear, or flattery. Not because they'd built walls, because they'd developed what he called psychological transparency, the ability to see through the mechanisms of influence that work effortlessly on most people. Guilt trips stopped working because you recognize them as a control tactics, not expressions of genuine hurt. Flattery stopped working because you could feel the agenda underneath the compliments. Fear-based pressure stopped working because you'd faced enough of your own darkness that external threats lost their leverage. You'd already confronted worse inside yourself than anything someone could threaten you with from outside. This sounds empowering, and it is, but Jung documented the cost. When you become immune to manipulation, you become threatening to anyone who relies on manipulation to maintain relationships. And that's more people than you'd want to believe. The parent who kept you close through guilt, the friend who kept you loyal through obligation, the partner who kept you invested through intermittent reinforcement, the colleague who managed you through subtle intimidation. When their tools stop working on you, they don't celebrate your growth, they escalate. And when escalation fails, they leave, or they force you to be the one who leaves. You've probably watched this happen in your own life. Relationships that seemed solid began crumbling as you changed. People who you thought loved you started treating you differently the moment you stopped responding to the old patterns. And the most painful part wasn't losing them. It was realizing that what you thought was love was actually a dynamic that required your compliance to function. When you stopped complying, the whole thing fell apart, and you were left wondering whether any of it was real. Jung would tell you that the relationships that collapse when you stop being controllable were never built on genuine connection. They were built on your unconsciousness, on your willingness to be manipulated without recognizing it, on your participation in dynamics that required you to stay small. Your growth didn't destroy those relationships. It revealed what they actually were. And that revelation, while devastating, is one of the clearest signs that your frequency has shifted beyond where those connections could survive. The third sign is that you need solitude the way other people need socialization, not as escape, not as avoidance, as genuine psychological necessity. Jung observed that people moving toward higher consciousness developed an increasing need for what he called sacred withdrawal, periods of deliberate isolation, where the psyche could integrate, process, and recalibrate without the constant interference of other people's energy and expectations. This confuses everyone around you. In a culture that treats socialization as the baseline for health and isolation as a warning sign, your need for alone time gets pathologized. People worry about you. They think you're depressed. They push you to get out more, connect more, be more social. And you try to explain that you're not lonely, that your solitude feels nourishing in a way that socializing rarely does anymore. And they look at you like something is broken. But Jung understood what was happening. Your consciousness is processing information at a depth that most people's never reaches. Every interaction, every conversation, every room you enter floods your awareness with layers of information that others don't perceive. The spoken words and the unspoken tensions, the performed emotions and the real ones underneath, the conscious intentions and the unconscious patterns driving them. You're taking in all of it, constantly, and your system needs space to metabolize what it's absorbing. Imagine running software that's exponentially more complex than what everyone around you is running. Their systems idle after conversations. Yours is still processing hours later, assembling patterns, integrating insights, making sense of the 17 layers you perceived in a 30-minute interaction. Of course, you need more downtime. Your consciousness is doing work that theirs never does. And that work requires silence, space, and the absence of incoming stimulation. Jung found that people who honored this need for solitude actually became more present and more connected in their relationships, not less. Because they weren't showing up depleted, they weren't running on empty, performing engagement while internally drowning. They were showing up replenished, clear, capable of genuine presence because they'd given themselves what they needed to function at the level their consciousness demanded. The fourth sign is one that catches people off guard. You've lost interest in being right. There was a time when winning the argument, proving your point, demonstrating your intelligence mattered to you. It validated something, made you feel solid, competent, worthy. But something shifted, and now the drive to be right feels hollow. Not because you've become passive or stopped having convictions, because you've realized something Jung documented extensively. The need to be right is almost always the ego defending itself against the terror of uncertainty. And if you found yourself sitting quietly while someone argues a point you know is flawed, not because you're intimidated, but because something in you recognizes that the deeper work isn't about correcting them, that's a frequency shift most people never experience. Jung called this the development of psychological humility, not false modesty, not performative deference. A genuine recognition that reality is so complex, so layered, so multidimensional that clinging to being right about any single perspective is a form of blindness disguised as clarity. People at this level of consciousness can hold contradictions. They can see that two opposing things might both be true. They can acknowledge that their understanding is partial without feeling threatened by that admission. And they can engage with ideas they disagree with, not to defeat them, but to understand what those ideas reveal about the person holding them. This isn't intellectual weakness, it's a kind of psychological strength that only develops after the ego has been humbled enough to stop needing every interaction to confirm its intelligence. And that's exactly what most people around you misunderstand. They think you've gone soft, lost your edge, stopped caring about truth. What actually happened is that your relationship with truth evolved beyond the binary of right and wrong into something more nuanced, more honest, and infinitely more lonely. Because the world runs on certainty, people bond over shared convictions, groups form around agreed-upon truths, and when you've moved into a space where you can hold uncertainty without anxiety, where you don't need the comfort of absolute positions, you stop fitting into those groups. You're not against them. You've just outgrown the need for the certainty they're offering. If this resonates, if you've been navigating this shift and looking for a way to go deeper into yourself with real structure, there's a guide we created called True Self-Discovery. 24 practical reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, built for exactly this kind of inner work. The work of understanding what's actually shifting inside you, instead of letting everyone else define it for you. You'll find the link below. The fifth sign is that you can feel dishonesty in your body before your mind registers it. This goes beyond intuition. Jung documented that individuals who had done extensive shadow integration developed a somatic response to inauthenticity that was nearly instantaneous. Someone would say something untrue, not necessarily a lie directed at you, sometimes just a performance they were giving themselves. And your body would respond before your conscious mind could even form the thought, something's off. A tightening in your chest, a subtle nausea, a feeling of energetic recoil, like something in you physically pulling back from the dissonance between what's being presented and what's actually true. You feel it in meetings where everyone agrees to something no one actually believes in. You feel it at family dinners where the performance of normalcy is suffocating. You feel it in conversations where someone is telling you who they are, and every cell in your body is registering who they actually are underneath. Jung connected this to what he observed about shadow perception. When you've confronted your own capacity for dishonesty, when you've acknowledged the ways you've performed and pretended and hidden, you develop an almost allergic sensitivity to those same patterns in others, not because you're judging them, because your system has been calibrated by your own honesty to detect the frequency of inauthenticity wherever it appears. You've tuned an instrument that can't be untuned. This makes casual social interaction genuinely difficult. Most social exchange operates on a foundation of small performances. People ask how you're doing and expect fine. People share curated versions of their lives. People perform emotions they think are appropriate rather than expressing what they actually feel. And you're standing in the middle of all this theater, feeling every gap between performance and reality, unable to participate in the collective agreement to pretend. You don't resent people for performing. You understand why they do it. You remember when you did it, but you can't do it anymore, and you can't be around it for long without feeling like you're suffocating. Not because you're superior, because your system has become so attuned to authenticity that prolonged exposure to inauthenticity creates a kind of energetic friction that's physically uncomfortable. The sixth sign is that your emotional responses have become slower, deeper, and less reactive. People who knew you before the shift think you've become cold. They remember someone who responded instantly, emotionally, intensely to everything, who could be pulled into drama in seconds, who matched energy reflexively, whether it was excitement or outrage or grief. And now they're looking at someone who pauses, who takes time before responding, who doesn't match the emotional intensity of the room. And they interpret this as disconnection when it's actually the opposite. Jung described this as the development of what he called the observing consciousness, a part of the psyche that can witness emotional experience without being consumed by it. This doesn't mean you feel less. You might actually feel more deeply than you ever have. But there's a space now between the stimulus and your response, a gap where awareness lives. And in that gap, you can choose how to respond rather than being hijacked by reactivity. This is one of the most misunderstood signs of higher frequency because it looks like apathy from the outside. Someone brings you news that would have sent the old you into a spiral, and you receive it calmly. Not because you don't care, because your nervous system has developed the capacity to hold intense emotion without being destabilized by it. You feel the full weight of the news. You just don't perform the expected reaction. And in a world that equates visible emotional intensity with genuine caring, your measured response reads as indifference. Think about the person who gets devastating news and goes quiet. Everyone around them panics. Why aren't they crying? Why aren't they falling apart? Something must be wrong. But inside, that person is processing at a depth the reactors never reach. They're feeling it completely, just not performing the feeling for an audience. They've moved beyond the stage where emotional expression needs to be visible to be real. And this confuses and sometimes threatens people who still need external evidence of internal experience. Jung found this observing consciousness was crucial for genuine psychological health because it allowed a person to respond to reality rather than react to their projections about reality. Most emotional reactivity isn't actually about what's happening. It's about what the situation triggers from the past. When you develop the space between stimulus and response, you can ask the essential question: am I reacting to what's actually happening right now, or am I reacting to what this reminds me of? That question alone changes everything, and the fact that you now have room to ask it is evidence of a frequency shift most people never undergo. The seventh sign is perhaps the most profound and the most isolating. You've stopped needing external validation to know what's true. You used to look outside yourself for confirmation. Was that experience real? Was my perception accurate? Am I right about this person? You'd poll friends, seek opinions, look for consensus before trusting your own knowing. But something changed. And now you know things, perceive things, understand things with a quiet certainty that doesn't need anyone else to confirm it. Jung called this the development of the internal locus of authority. It's the psychological milestone where the center of truth shifts from outside to inside, where you stop needing others to agree with your perception before you trust it, where your own direct experience becomes the primary source of knowing and external opinions become secondary data rather than the determining factor. This sounds liberating, and it is, but it's also profoundly lonely, because when you no longer need validation, you also lose the comfort that validation provides, the reassurance, the sense of shared reality, the feeling that you're not alone in what you're perceiving. When your locus of authority moves inside, you become the sole witness to your own truth. And carrying that alone, especially when your truth contradicts what everyone around you believes, creates a specific kind of isolation that Jung found was one of the highest costs of psychological development. You see it in relationships when someone tells you everything is fine, and your entire being registers that nothing is fine, and you no longer need them to admit it for you to know it's true. You feel it at work when a decision is made that everyone celebrates and something in you recognizes the flaw that won't become visible for months. You experience it in your own healing when you know you've shifted in ways no one around you can see, and you don't need them to see it for it to be real. Jung emphasized that this internal authority wasn't arrogance or delusion. It was the natural result of having done enough inner work to trust the instrument of your own consciousness. You've calibrated yourself through years of honest self-confrontation, shadow integration, and the willingness to face truths about yourself that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Of course, you trust what you perceive. You've earned that trust through the hardest work a person can do, the work of becoming psychologically honest with yourself. But here's what makes this sign so specifically painful. The people around you often experience your internal authority as rejection of them. When you don't need their validation, they feel unnecessary. When you trust your own perception over group consensus, they feel dismissed. When you act on your inner knowing without seeking approval, they feel excluded. Your self-trust inadvertently threatens the dynamic that most relationships are built on, the mutual exchange of validation. And when you no longer need that exchange, the relationship loses the glue that held it together. If you recognize these 7 signs in your life, if you've been experiencing the isolation of outgrowing your old frequency while not yet finding the people who match your new one, understand this. Jung didn't see this process as pathology. He saw it as the most significant psychological achievement a person could undergo. The movement toward wholeness, the integration of shadow, the development of genuine consciousness, the willingness to become who you actually are, even when that person doesn't fit anywhere you used to belong. These signs aren't evidence that something is wrong with you. They're evidence that something is working, that the inner transformation you've been undergoing is real, even when no one around you can see it or name it, that the discomfort you're feeling isn't breakdown but recalibration. Your system is adjusting to a new way of operating, and the friction you feel against your old environment is the natural consequence of having changed while everything around you stayed the same. Jung would tell you that the loneliness of higher consciousness isn't permanent, even though it feels permanent right now. People who have undergone genuine transformation eventually find each other, not through seeking but through resonance. You'll recognize them the same way you recognize inauthenticity, instantly in your body, without needing proof. And those connections, rare as they'll be, will hold more depth, honesty, and genuine seeing than anything your old frequency could have produced. The cost of this shift is real, the grief is real, the isolation is real, but what you're becoming is also real. And Jung spent his life documenting that the people who endured the cost of consciousness, who kept going when the loneliness felt unbearable, who chose authenticity over belonging, were the ones who eventually arrived at a way of living that wasn't just tolerable, but profoundly true. Not easy, not painless, but true. And for people operating at the frequency you're reaching, truth eventually matters more than comfort. That's the clearest sign of all. If you haven't yet, and you're ready to take this inner work deeper with real structure and guidance rooted in what Jung actually taught, we put together True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within, especially during the kind of shift you might be going through right now. The link is right below.